Before the first grave was ever dug into earth, before Adam wept for his son, and long before Cain's jealous hand brought blood to the soil, there was death in heaven, a death no one speaks of. A being was erased not just from memory, but from eternity itself. And unlike the death of man, this one left a scar in the fabric of the spiritual realm, a scar we were never supposed to see. Why is it missing from the scriptures? Why does no prophet name the first one who fell, not by exile, but by annihilation? And what kind of being could die in the very place where death was not meant to exist? Was it an angel, a rebel, or something even older, something that predated the rebellion itself? The truth has been hidden beneath verses we've read 1,000 times, just not with the eyes to see. One ancient scroll, preserved in fragments and ignored by councils, hints at a celestial act so violent it shook the foundations of the heavens. It speaks of a light extinguished, not for rebellion, but for contamination. A being so corrupted it could no longer be cast out, it had to be unmade. And those who witnessed it were sworn never to speak again. Not even Lucifer's exile was treated with such silence. But why? Why would God allow us to know the names of demons, of fallen ones, even of the serpent, but not of the first to die? Perhaps because this death wasn't part of a war. Perhaps it was part of a warning, a moment so dark even the heavens had to be cleansed. This is the story erased from the first pages, the one that tells us evil didn't begin with man, and death didn't either. In some early Jewish mystical writings, there's a strange phrase, the one whose breath was removed. Scholars gloss over it, calling it metaphor. But in the older versions, that line is paired with a vision of a being who stood before the throne, who once held a role of beauty, yet carried within him something foreign. Not pride, not rebellion, but infection, a corruption not taught, not chosen, but born. This being did not lead others astray. He did not command a third of the angels. He didn't fall like Lucifer. He was isolated, observed, and then he vanished. In the records that survive, this act is described not as punishment, but as a purging, something that had to be removed, not to protect heaven from rebellion, but from spiritual decay. And it wasn't just his body that was destroyed, it was his essence. There are no chants to remember him, no warnings carved in holy places. His name was swallowed, his light extinguished like a star collapsing into silence. Yet fragments remain in Psalms that speak of those who shall not rise, and in Ezekiel's lament for the one who was perfect, until iniquity was found in you. But Ezekiel was speaking of a pattern, not just of Lucifer, but of a prototype, the first to rot from within. And what if that rot wasn't personal, but cosmic? What if the heavens were not merely the domain of perfect light, but also the first battleground for purity? This being may not have sinned by choice, but by nature. And God, in his infinite holiness, had no other option but to remove what could never be redeemed. Not judged, not corrected, just erased completely. Among the celestial host, there is a silence more profound than reverence, a silence of fear. Not the fear of punishment, but of memory. In the rare apocalyptic visions granted to prophets like Isaiah, Daniel, and John, angels appear with trembling covering their faces, declaring, "Holy, holy, holy." But what if that reverence hides something deeper? What if they remember a time when holiness wasn't enough to protect one of their own? In ancient Aramaic scrolls attributed to the Book of the Watchers, there are cryptic lines about the one removed before the watchers stood. While much of the text focuses on the fall of angels who lusted after human women, there's a lone stanza that speaks of a spirit consumed by fire who left no echo, not cast down, not exiled, consumed. The act, it says, was swift and final, lest the corruption spread through light like a disease. We often think of heaven as unchanging, But even the book of Revelation speaks of war in heaven. What if that war wasn't the beginning? What if it was a second conflict, one born out of fear that what happened once could happen again? The first death wasn't a casualty of rebellion, it was a containment, a memory that the heavenly realms could be infected, and that God himself had to act as judge and executioner. And so the memory of this being was deleted from the song of creation. Angels were forbidden to speak his name. His image was never recorded, and over time he became less than myth. He became uncreation. And yet, something of that moment lingers in the tremble of Gabriel's voice, in the sword of the cherub, in the silence before the throne. A silence that says, "This happened once, and it cannot happen again." After that moment, everything changed in the unseen realm. A new law was whispered across the heavens, not written, not spoken aloud, but known. That holiness was not just brilliance, but purity under threat. The angelic order became more than servants. They became sentinels, not just guarding creation, but guarding each other from ever becoming what that one being had become. A memory erased, but a fear preserved. From that point on, we see traces of this change. In the fierce guardianship of Eden, in the strict separation between heaven and the fallen realm, in the way God's presence must be veiled by smoke or cloud, lest anything impure be destroyed in an instant. The tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, all echoes of that heavenly protocol. Protect purity, contain corruption, don't let it happen again. There are ancient rabbinic traditions that speak of the flame before the cherubim. Some mystics believed it was not just a symbol of God's presence, but a weapon, a barrier that could disintegrate anything unworthy before it reached the throne. This wasn't just divine majesty, it was defense, because once something unworthy had made it too close, and heaven never recovered. Even the narrative of Lucifer may be a smokescreen, a convenient villain to explain the fall. But perhaps Lucifer's rebellion was inspired by what came before, not envy of God, but envy of that first being's closeness to him, the one whose destruction left behind not a legend, but a void. And in that void, darker ambitions were born. He who watched the first, a death, became the next to fall. The book of Job opens with a strange counsel in heaven. God is surrounded by sons of God, spiritual beings, among whom Satan appears. But no mention is made of fear, no reminder of a past death, no caution about the presence of evil. And yet, in the silence between the lines, there's tension. It's as if the courtroom has known blood before, as if this was not the first time a presence stood there with corrupted intent and paid the price. What if Job's story isn't just about suffering on earth, but about the fragility of spiritual order? What if Satan's testing of Job was allowed not just to prove faith, but to prove that evil could still be contained without destruction? That after the first death, God no longer wished to erase, but to judge slowly, to allow choice. The being who died first may not have had that option. In Revelation, John sees a third of the stars swept from heaven. A war, a dragon, Michael rising to fight. But even in that cosmic war, the fallen are cast down, not destroyed. Why? If God once removed a being entirely from existence, why show mercy to Lucifer and his angels? Unless what died in heaven first was different, not rebellious, not defiant, but diseased, a being whose very existence had become unredeemable. And that would change everything. It would mean that sin, as we know it, wasn't the first threat to creation. It would mean that rebellion came after corruption, that evil didn't begin with a choice, but with a mutation, a distortion of light so deep it had no cure. And perhaps that's why we aren't told, because if we knew how easily the perfect can become perverted, we might never sleep again. Now think of Eden, a paradise guarded by a flaming sword, closed off after man's fall. But why such violence? Why not simply remove Adam and Eve and let the garden rest? The imagery suggests a threat far greater than human rebellion. That sword wasn't just to block sinners, it was to prevent something deeper from re-entering. Something heaven had once dealt with in fire. Eden wasn't just protected, it was quarantined. The tree of life stood in Eden, but so did the tree of knowledge. One offered eternity, the other awareness. But neither was called dangerous until the serpent came. The serpent who didn't force Eve but whispered, who wasn't called Satan until much later, who knew things no earthly being should know. Could it be that the spirit behind the serpent had seen the first death, or worse, was born from it? What if the serpent was not the origin of evil, but its messenger, a shadow of the first being who was erased, a fragment of the corruption that once stood before the throne? In Genesis, the serpent is described as more subtle than any beast. That Hebrew word arum also means naked or exposed. It hints at a being that had been stripped of glory, of covering, of identity. So when the serpent spoke, it wasn't just temptation, it was legacy, a continuation of what began before the world, a voice that once echoed in heavenly halls, now slithered through garden leaves. The first death wasn't forgotten, its echo lived on. Not as memory, but as influence. And though Eden fell, the fire that had consumed one being long ago now hovered, unseen, over all of mankind. The prophets of old often spoke in riddles. Isaiah spoke of a morning star cast down. Ezekiel wept over a king who was once a guardian in Eden. But what if these weren't just about Lucifer? What if their words carried echoes of someone older, someone whose fall was too ancient to name, a death so holy and terrible that even prophets feared to describe it directly? So they layered it beneath imagery, cloaked in lamentations and visions. One fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls, badly damaged, refers to a spirit who fell in silence, without sound, without judgment. Scholars dismiss it as poetic metaphor. But what if silence was the judgment? What if God's sentence on this being was erasure? Not punishment in the lake of fire, not exile, but absolute removal. The kind of judgment so final, no name survives, and that would explain something else. Why angels fear to sin, why even demons tremble at the name of the Lord. It's not just reverence, it's memory. They remember what happened to the first one who crossed the line, the one who wasn't offered rebellion or redemption, only obliteration. And ever since, the spiritual realm has lived with that tension, the knowledge that some mistakes are beyond correction. That's why Scripture is so careful when describing God's holiness, a consuming fire, too pure to look upon iniquity. These aren't just descriptions, they're warnings. Because once, holiness didn't forgive. It consumed. And the echoes of that first death still ripple through every altar, every temple, every moment of spiritual trembling, not just because of what happened, but because it could happen again. If we accept that this first death truly happened, then we must also ask, why hide it? Why would God allow Scripture to mention wars in heaven, fallen angels, and even Satan's name, but not this? Perhaps because this death introduces a reality too heavy for human minds, a reality that says not all beings get a second chance, that even in heaven, where purity reigns, destruction is sometimes the only option. Such knowledge could shatter us. It could make us question the nature of grace, or fear that redemption has limits. That's why it was buried, not to deceive, but to protect, to shield fragile minds from the weight of divine justice in its rawest form. For if heaven itself once had to burn something from its midst, what does that say about the fragility of even the highest creation? This might be why Jesus' message was so revolutionary. He didn't come only to forgive sin, he came to interrupt a pattern that had once ended in annihilation. His sacrifice was not just for humanity, but for all creation, to ensure that no being would ever have to be unmade again. That mercy would reach where once only silence had been allowed. Paul's letter to the Colossians says that Christ reconciled all things in heaven and on earth. A strange phrase. Why would heaven need reconciliation? Unless there had once been something unreconciled, something broken, something erased. The first death, the wound no one speaks of, the moment eternity flinched, and God set a plan in motion to ensure it would never happen again. When Jesus cried out on the cross, "It is finished," he wasn't just ending a human sacrifice, he was closing a cosmic loop. He was putting a seal on a story that began before man, before the serpent, before the fall. A story that started with the first being to die in heaven. A being whose name was lost, but whose death cast a shadow across all of creation. Christ's blood didn't just cover sin. It covered the memory of what was once too dark to speak. This is why the veil in the temple was torn, not just as a symbol of access, but as a declaration that what once had to be destroyed could now be redeemed, that the fire guarding Eden no longer meant death, it meant purification, that heaven no longer had to erase what was corrupted. Now it could heal. The cross wasn't just victory over sin, it was mercy over extinction, and yet heaven still remembers. The angels still carry that silence. It's in their eyes when they descend in visions. It's in their voices when they speak in scripture. That first death taught them reverence, fear, and the cost of unchecked corruption. It taught them that holiness without grace is a fire that burns all, that even they, the sons of light, are not beyond judgment, so they worship endlessly, not just out of praise, but out of remembrance, because they saw what happens when something unholy tries to dwell among the holy, and they saw what God had to do. The death that was never written down became the law etched into their being. And when they look at us, fragile, fallen, but forgiven, they see the miracle of mercy that was never offered to the first. There's a reason no preacher speaks of this. No seminary teaches it. It's not because it's forbidden, but because it's buried, hidden behind metaphors, lost in apocryphal whispers, veiled in the silence of heaven itself. The death of that first being wasn't just a loss, it was a fracture, a scar in the fabric of eternity that even Scripture only hints at. And yet, that silence is louder than thunder. It speaks of the cost, of being near God without being one with Him. And maybe that's the true danger, not that evil exists, but that even holiness, when misaligned, can implode. That the closer one gets to the light, the more dangerous impurity becomes. The first death wasn't a rebellion, it was a contamination. And its removal wasn't punishment, it was preservation. The destruction of something too close, too flawed, too dangerous to let remain. But now we live in an age where that chasm has been bridged, where the fire that once consumed now refines, where mercy stands, where silence once reigned, and though we still don't speak the name of the first to die, we live under the grace that he never knew. That's the untold truth of heaven's history. That's why Christ matters, not just to us, but to the heavens themselves. So next time you read of angels trembling, of holy fire, of temples and thrones, remember, it's not just grandeur, it's memory. It's the echo of a death that shaped the laws of eternity. The first to fall not in sin, but in corruption. The one no one speaks of, because God himself erased him. If this hidden truth stirred something in your spirit, don't let it stay in silence. Share this message with someone who needs to understand that heaven has scars too. And if you've ever felt unworthy, remember, the first death received no second chance. But you did. That is grace. That is the difference. Comment below, and tell us, from which city in the world are you watching this revelation? Let's see how far this truth can travel. And if this message blessed you, subscribe, turn on the notifications, and help us spread what was once erased from the heavens.